Hello everyone and welcome to the first of the Regional Community Childcare Development Fund supported professional learning opportunities. This is Phase 1, Module 1, where we're going to talk about trauma and how it can affect brain development and then subsequently behaviour. This is the first of 5 modules that are offered in Phase 1 and our emphasis in Phase 1 is prevention of problem behaviour and understanding child development. I'd like to start with some acknowledgements for these resources. Firstly, Dr. Bruce Perry and the Child Trauma Academy. You can see the web link there. They have some absolutely fantastic resources which I really recommend that you check out via that hyperlink. I'd also like to thank the Australian Childhood Foundation for many of their resources and especially the SMART online training. SMART stands for Strategies for Managing Abuse-Related Trauma. This online training is free and I highly recommend it. It's really fantastic training. So some really great resources that I highly recommend you get into if you are interested in this material. So we're going to start our session with a bit of a definition of what is trauma. And there are a number of different definitions and these are just a few that I've selected that I think teach us something important about understanding the experience of children who may have experienced trauma. So the first partial definition is that trauma is an event which overwhelms the person's capacity to cope. Stress can actually be a good and positive thing. Little dabs of stress that are predictable and measured can be actually really good for our development, but trauma is quite different. Trauma overwhelms the person's capacity to cope. Another part of the definition of trauma is that it induces an abnormally intense and prolonged stress response. So that is that the traumatic event happens and the person's stress levels go up to 12 out of 10. Then the traumatic event stops happening, but the person's alarm system remains on after the event. Their stress system stays at that 12 out of 10 level for quite a long time after the traumatic event. So that's another feature that's important about trauma, is that it activates the alarm system and keeps that activation going for a long time. Another thing that's relevant for us today about trauma is that in children, trauma might be expressed by disorganised or agitated behaviour. So children, it's not typical that they will come up to us and say, I've experienced a traumatic event over the weekend and I'd like to talk about how this might be affecting me in the classroom. That's not often how kids present, but we will see that disorganised or agitated behaviour, so lots of movement, walking around, touching things, signs of psychomotor agitation, or disorganised behaviour, having difficulty sequencing events. That is either performing things in a sequence, so if you give a 2 or 3 step instruction, they may have a great deal of difficulty with that, or difficulty remembering things in sequence and sequencing things in a narrative order. So some of those things might be presentations in children that may indicate trauma. I really like this graph from Dr. Bruce Perry because it shows the way that different people can respond to a traumatic event and the effects that a traumatic event can have on that person's emotional state. So on the left hand side you can see the person's emotional state of stress going from calm down the bottom up and up through vigilance, alarm, fear and terror. And then along the bottom of the graph we've got time going from left to right. So we have before the traumatic event, then the traumatic event itself, and then time going after the traumatic event. So the typical reaction when a traumatic event happens, the majority of people during a traumatic event will go up into a state of absolute terror, overwhelming their capacity to cope and think and work through options at that time. That's how most people will respond. I'll talk about the blue line in just a minute, but typical people, we don't really like the word normal, but it's on this graph, typical people who have supports around them, have supportive people to talk to and routines to engage with again, they will come back down out of that state of absolute terror within the space of a few weeks. We would think it would be typical for someone to still be in a state of fear or alarm or vigilance for some weeks after they've experienced a traumatic event. People who are vulnerable, and some people are just made that way, they're just a bit more vulnerable to post-trauma symptoms, If they have support around them, if they have people that they can talk to, if they have routines that they can engage with, if they have positive peers, they will still come back down into that state of calm, but it will take them a little bit longer. People who are vulnerable and also have few supports around them, they will stay in that state of terror for a much, much longer time than the typical person. So an event might have happened and someone who's vulnerable might stay in a state of terror that we might not be able to see, but in an emotional state of terror for many, many weeks or even months after that traumatic event. Some people have a slightly different reaction to traumatic events, and those are sometimes people who are particularly resilient. I think about people who are able to do jobs like being a police officer or a paramedic. I know that I wouldn't be able to manage the stress of seeing those kind of things, but some people are quite resilient to seeing those things. And some people have a reaction called dissociation, which is basically if you can't get away from the traumatic event in your body, if you can't fight it and you can't flee from it, then you'll try to go somewhere else and your mind will try to take you somewhere else. So it's dissociating from the event. But the main thing to take out of this graph, and I'm grateful to Dr. Bruce Perry for it, is that most people, it is typical to have a terror response to a traumatic event and then come down to a state of calm again after that event. So that's what happens when there is a single traumatic event that happens to a person. What may be more typical and also maybe a presentation you might see in children is actually the experience of chronic trauma. So this is when there are multiple traumatic events, when there are things that happen again and again and again in that person's life. So for example, a child who's exposed to domestic violence, then is involved in a car accident, then might be a victim of community violence or has some sort of ongoing trauma like physical abuse or sexual abuse or neglect or war, living in a refugee camp. And the effects of that chronic trauma are often cumulative, which Dr. Perry has also put in this graph, which I think explains it really nicely. These three lines represent three different people. I was only able to do two different colours, but they represent three different people and their emotional states and emotional responses to multiple different traumas. So we have the state of stress on the left-hand side of the graph, from calm, vigilance, alarm, fear, and terror up the top. And then we have time going along the bottom again from left to right. So the person may start off in a state of calm before the first traumatic event. During the traumatic event, many people will go up into a state of fear or terror. And then they'll start coming back down to a state of calm again, which may take some weeks or months in a typical person. But before they've had the chance to get back to a calm state again, event 2 happens, the second traumatic event happens, and they go back up into that state of terror again. Then after that second event, they will start coming back down to a calmer level, but before they get the chance to come back to a calm state again, the third traumatic event may happen. And you can reflect on some of the people that we work with in our context, and they may have had many, many traumatic events happen to them. And what can happen, and I think Dr. Perry shows this really well on this graph, is that person's baseline, that person's version of normal or what they think of as calm for themselves might actually be reset at a much higher level. Their version of what it feels like to be calm might actually to be in a state of fear all the time. That's really important for us to consider, because when we're in a state of fear or even in a state of alarm, we don't think the same way that we do when we're calm. We don't always make the best decisions when we're in a stressed state. So knowing that some children and young people may be coming to us with a baseline state that is in fear or alarm rather than calm, and probably not even really being aware of that either, helps us to understand why sometimes they might respond in ways that we might think are that are unpredictable, because they might look calm, but their internal state might actually be a state of fear as their baseline, as their version of normal. I'd like to commend to you these videos by Dr. Bruce Perry. If you have time now, you could press pause on this video and watch using this YouTube link. You can also search for Dr. Bruce Perry and the 7 Slide series. It's a really fantastic introduction to brain development. The hyperlinks for these are in these slides, but they are also on the handouts that accompany these slides, or you can simply find it via YouTube as well. So I commend those to you for some further information on brain development. I'm going to talk briefly about brain development. I don't do it as well as Dr. Perry, but I will try very hard. And the things that a developing brain needs. How do we grow a healthy brain? To grow a healthy brain, obviously we need food and sleep and those kind of things, but what brains really seek is relationships and positive experiences. Brains really need those positive experiences and a consistent and secure environment. So the key brain food or brain fertilizer for growing a healthy brain is interactions with adults. Interactions with adults that are positive, interactions with adults that are consistent, and interactions with adults that help kids learn about how other people see the world so they can develop some theory of mind. Interactions with adults where adults talk to children and are interested to listen to them so that kids can learn about language and how we use language to mediate our experiences. So interactions with adults, looking at adults, adults looking at them, talking to adults, playing with adults, that's how healthy brains develop. That's our brain fertilizer, is our interactions with children. The most important thing we can do is interact warmly, positively, and frequently with kids, because that's what helps their brains grow, even more than good food and sleep. Interactions with adults are really key. This graphic comes from the Australian Childhood Foundation, from the SMART training that I mentioned before, which is excellent training and I commend it to you. This concept that I've got here about a person brain, mammal brain and crocodile brain, it's called the triune brain concept, and it was developed by an American neuroscientist called Paul MacLean. He suggested it as a way of thinking about the brain, and I think it's kind of useful for us understanding the different bits of the brain and how they develop. So the first bit of the human brain to develop is the bottom bit of the brain. So if you think about the back of your neck and the back of your head down the bottom there, the brainstem and the cerebellum are the first bits to develop. And we can think of that as the crocodile brain because it does the things that crocodiles do. So it keeps our heart beating, it keeps us breathing, it lets us know when we're hungry or not. It's where fight or flight lives. It's a really early developing part of the brain. The next bit of the brain that starts developing we can think of as the mammal brain. The limbic system, or the emotional centre, does most of its really exciting development between the ages of 1 to 4, still does some development after that. But that's the bit of the brain, we think of it as the mammal brain because it does the things that mammals do that crocodiles don't. So crocodiles generally like to live by themselves, don't need a whole lot of social skills, but mammals tend to like to live in groups and tend to need to understand other members of that group. So they need to understand emotions and they need to understand facial expressions that express those emotions. So that bit of the brain is really key for us being successful in human relationships, to have so the ability to understand and control our own emotions and understand the emotions of those around us. The person brain is the last bit of the brain to really start developing, and that's the bit of the brain that does the things that we do as people that other animals tend not to do. So things like understanding language, planning ahead into the future, thinking about things like today, tomorrow and the week after, reasoning and judging, being able to have two options and choose the best one, and self-control very much lives in the person bit of the brain. So it's very important for for acting like a person and being a successful person, we need a strong and healthy person brain. So that does most of its really exciting development between about the ages of 3 and 6, but still keeps developing well into adulthood. I'm going to pause this video here, and the next part of the video will be in part B of the phase 1 video.